There I am. So I thought maybe it would be instructional just to spend a minute and talk about where I've been and where I'm going, because it sort of sets the stage for this talk. I started with SAP. My background is enterprise software, and I found the last session super interesting because it touches on many of the same topics that I'm going to touch on today. My background is enterprise software, but I also have experience as an investor. I was with SAP Ventures. I ran the venture fund for 5 years, and that clearly invested in enterprise tech. And then I was at a smaller startup, Citrix. Then I started my own startup, a data analytics company, which I sold to Workday in 2015. And now I run product at Zenefits. And I tell you that because I'm going to weave various examples and stories from my personal past into this presentation. So clearly, I'm not telling you anything new. It's very, very different to start a new company versus actually scaling it. And certainly in the early stages of growth and establishing the company, very important to get MVP, get an initial product out into the market, test it, iterate on it, refine it. And then very little cash, conservatively, maybe you've raised a seed round, friends and family, some other maybe convertible note. And then as you enter that second stage, really around launching, get the product into the market, you established a go-to-market, you test pricing strategies, all very standard things, which I'm sure you guys have already heard about numerous times today. And then really once you find that product market fit, then investing aggressively to scale the business. And there's a couple of things that I'd like to touch on that I think are really important as you go through this process. And I'll start with what the problem is, how you set the team up, how you should think about product, at least from my perspective, a couple of the basics which absolutely have to be addressed, and then finally how I've thought about capital, and you might find it interesting as well. So I mentioned this yesterday in the keynote that Lex and I did around Zenefits, but the whole idea of really starting a company, finding a problem. It's so much easier to start a company if it's a problem that you're intimately familiar with. And it also makes a much better story. And I think there was even a session yesterday on storytelling. I just can't emphasize, as you build your company, as you continue to raise money, bring on new investors, how important this concept of the story is. Because I've been on the other side of the table as an investor, and it just makes a much richer, interesting conversation. So I wouldn't discount that. In the case of Gridcraft, which was the data analytics company that I sold to Workday, basically think Google Sheets on steroids meets Microsoft Excel. So we ran a huge cloud scale database, sucked in all kinds of data, but the UI, the user interface, was basically looked like Microsoft Excel, and the whole idea was self-service business analytics. And for anyone who's managed a P&L, been a GM in an environment like I was at Citrix, it's a huge issue. People take numbers, spreadsheets out of big products like Hyperion and others, and no one wants to work in Hyperion, right? Everyone wants to work in Excel. I mean, everyone wants to work in Excel, right? It's so rich, tons of capabilities, but what's the problem with Excel? Sharing. You know, you think about Google Sheets, you think about Google Drive, everyone wants to share. So that was the problem, and I was intimately familiar with, and it made, I think, a pretty good story. And, you know, my measure of that was, you know, the exit to Workday. The next thing I wanted to touch on is team. When you're starting out, you know, you're going to have a small team, and one of the most important things, I think, is really to figure out what your strengths are. If you have a wonderful engineering team, double down on that. That's one of your key differentiators as you build the company and move up market. The next thing I wanted to touch on was the importance of culture. This is Ben Horowitz from Andreessen Horowitz, and he was a speaker at our user conference this past fall, and we focus a lot on culture. Zenefits has had a really interesting ride through the market, so the whole idea around culture and team is incredibly important to us right now. And I think more broadly, it's super important as you build your company and scale it. And I think I can't underestimate the importance of really laying out the culture at the very beginning. Those values that the senior team holds dear to their heart, those manifest itself as culture. And if you don't take charge of that, when there's 3 of you, it's going to be out of control by the time that there's, you know, 800 of you in the organization. So I wouldn't underestimate that. The next thing is, early on, as you start to scale, build your team, really important to maintain your network. I'm sure everyone in here has a super, rich and broad network, and I've always found that it's really helpful, obviously to first pull out of your network as you're getting those first, 50, 60 people on board. And in the case of Gridcraft for us, and a lot of people, think everything is happening in Silicon Valley. Well, I actually live in Boulder, Colorado. That's where the Rockies, the big mountains are, and we ski and everything. And I commute on a weekly basis to Zenefits, which is in San Francisco. So for us at Gridcraft, I would say loosely all of the early employees we had kind of came out of our networks, and largely it was out of Oracle and other companies like that, because my two co-founders were from Oracle. And as I mentioned before, we sold it to Workday in 2017. The other thing around team I want to touch on, and all the statistics prove this out, the gender diversity, ethnic diversity, diversity in the organization builds a much, much stronger team. And it's not just me saying that. You can pull up studies from McKinsey, Deloitte. You can look at boards, high-functioning boards, performance of those companies. And we've even seen it with a lot of bad behavior over the past year and last year at various companies. So don't underestimate the value of diversity inside your organization. And the next thing I just wanted to touch on underneath team is, and it was really fun and interesting for me to hear the last session around design, and I'll touch on that in just a minute. The importance of design, importance of employee experience. A lot of this is being driven right now of what we see in the workforce. So traditional boomers, Gen Xers, silence, and I honestly have to admit, I have no idea. I had someone help me with these slides. I have no idea what the silents are, and I meant to Google it before I showed up. Does anyone know what the silent? Yeah, I have no idea. But anyway, I'll get on that. But the whole idea of the millennials, it's unbelievable, and we see this at Zenefits. We see who we're selling our product to. We see their expectations around employee experience, delighting the customer, all the things you heard in the last session. I totally support, and I totally underscore the importance of that. And for millennials in the marketplace, the expectations that they have about the type of companies they work at, the kinds of products they want, it's totally flipped everything in the way we've thought about enterprise software, which is kind of where I come from. It's flipped that entire conversation. And as you can see, it's estimated by 2025 that obviously, a lot of the boomers and older people will be retiring, myself included. And so by 2025, it's going to be a totally different environment of people that work at your companies that you're scaling right now, as well as people who are buying products out in the market. So that influences both team makeup as well as how you design your products. And for those millennials, which we just saw in the last slide, and we're super, super sensitive to this at Zenefits, a lot of things that traditionally we've valued, I talk about people of my generation, things like your salary, your title, your brand, how you dress, even how you dress. It gets flipped totally on its head, because that's not the way millennials are thinking about it. And things that are important to your team and your culture as your organization as you continue to scale it, and obviously as time moves forward, much different things. And I had a couple of stats here. 87% of millennials say that career development is important in a job. They expect that from their organization. And then 93% have left an employer to change roles, get a different perspective. It wasn't a good culture fit. So again, the numbers prove out it's very, very important how you compose your team in order to scale your business. Now I'm going to shift over and talk about out of team and now talk about product. And I don't need to say a lot about this slide because you heard about it just a minute ago in the last session if you were here. The whole idea around, there's so many ways now to identify opportunities in the market, test out what your customers want, A/B testing, and then the whole idea around UX, design, the importance of that as you build the product. And my advice is build something beautiful that sells itself. And that's whether it's enterprise, really high in the market like Workday, word of mouth, delightful customers. You see that over and over again from Workday, as well as lower in the market where it's delightful and it's a friction-free sales process. It's a go-to-market that's maybe much more self-serve. It's really applicable to products that shoot at both different ends of the market. And one thing I'm just going to touch on, and I'm sure it's been in numerous sessions over the past day and a half, but the whole idea of product market fit, I advocate that it's not magical. Everyone talks about it, how it's like some magical thing you're going to know, and the sun's going to come out. I've never found that to work for me, whether I was investing or whether I was an entrepreneur. The best I can say is that you probably know if you don't have product market fit, but I'm not sure if there's ever a point at which the switch flips like immediately and you have it. The one thing I would say is that I always focused on was just that repeatable sales model. If I could start to see a repeatable sales model and see my customer acquisition costs start to decline, then you're on that trajectory. But I would hesitate to say it's this magical thing. And I just want to I'm not a process junkie, but there are just some basics that you absolutely, whether you start your company and you're 10 people or you've scaled it up and you've got 600 people in the organization like Zenefits and you're on an upward trajectory, but don't discount the importance of ensuring that you have the right legal advisor. You at least have a firm that you work with, and that can be obviously on fundraising, but it's also things like employee issues. Just make sure you have someone in your corner on the legal side. On the accounting side, obviously, as you scale your business, you're going to scale out. You'll have a VP of finance, eventually a CFO. But early on, make sure you have a contractor who can do the accounting. You have one to support you on those basics. The next one is the cap table. Don't ignore your cap table. I've seen so many companies, as they start to build, they raise additional layers of capital, more preferences. Don't lose sight of that. There's wonderful products on the market like eShares and others where you can electronically manage that. So don't lose sight of that. And process. That ties back to culture. You don't want it to be overbearing, but you need to have some structure in the organization. It will make it much easier as you scale your business. And the last one I want to touch on is capital. How much, how soon? I mean, it's a huge issue. There's a lot of talk about it. You don't want to go out too early, then it makes it more difficult. And so just really thoughtful around how do we manage that. And whether you're raising early on a very small round like 500,000 or you're raising 10 million, thinking about what kind of investor do you want to work with? I mean, it's almost like marrying someone. You're going to be with that person for better or for worse over a very long ride. So I would suggest just really interview your investor like they interview you and get as many people as you can into that funnel and be very cognizant of that relationship, the milestones that you lay out that you have to hit in order to raise your next round and move forward. One last thing related to fundraising, and I've seen this on both sides because I had it with my startup and then also because I was an investor with SAP and with Vista Ventures. The whole idea is don't, my motto is less is more, and this is kind of what we used when we were at Gridcraft. Our investor deck, pitch deck was 12 slides. Our elevator pitch, 2 paragraphs. If you couldn't explain your company in 2 paragraphs, you have an issue. And an executive summary for more detail, about 2 pages. And yeah, and so to summarize, because I have about 40 seconds, I would just say, a big one, take care of your investors. When you start out small, you should be sending out a monthly or a quarterly investor update. Trust me, when you're really big and you're at 80 million or something, it's going to be very broad and complex, and your CFO will help you write it. But get that kind of discipline in your organization early because you're accountable to your investors. Know your cap table, which I mentioned before. Always be measuring engagement. That's going to tell you so much around product market fit, opportunity to scale that business. Always have an eye on churn. I mean, I'm sure you've heard that in numerous sessions previously. Don't underprice. Do not underprice. It's always easier to drop your price than to raise your price. That was one of my biggest lessons from Gridcraft. And the last one is get a lead investor and the rest will follow. And with that, I have Oh, I'm over by 19 seconds. Yeah. Sure. Are there any questions? Sure. Yeah, so the question was from MVP, you need to see the product market fit, and then you need to understand the traction. So how do you measure really what your traction is, and right, yeah. So one thing I would say is that we actually instrumented a product called Intercom into our solution. And off of that, and I highly recommended it for Gridcraft, it was a great tool. And it allowed us to see in terms of traction, what kind of uptake we were getting around product upsells, types of engagement, how many times were they logging in to the solution, what were the flows that they were following inside the product, and where were the investors coming from, or not investors, where were the users coming from, what parts of the world. You could see that as well, and it was this incredible analytics tool. So just being very tactical, that was a wonderful tool for us to understand what those milestones look like, which were important for fundraising. Intercom. I'm a huge advocate. Two tools if you're early stage, eShares for your cap table and Intercom to measure what I just spoke about. Any? Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah. How do you manage that conflict? You've got decision makers and movement, you want to build it in areas. Yeah. That's such a good question. So the question was, the people in charge like right now in 2017 are like the boomers, but they're on their way out. And if you're an early stage company, cool tech, cool design, stuff like that, who's using it? The millennials. So it's a huge issue. And for a lot of what I've seen work and what we did as well as Gridcraft was get in and sell at the department level. Don't try to make a big enterprise sale at a high level. Try to get in and seed it at the lower level. And then that delight that they have, enthusiasm for the product, help them push them up to more of the senior decision makers in the organization. Can I do one more? Okay, final.
When something bad happens, like what happened at Zenefits, how does leadership then respond?
Yeah, that's a great question. When something bad happens or rough, like at Zenefits, how does leadership respond? So I think it's a huge challenge. And so for us, we have an incredible focus, and that's why I had 6 slides on it around culture. So I'm part of the new Zenefits. I came on board in August. The whole idea, if you have a crisis in the organization, I think you've seen that like in Uber, you've seen it in Zenefits and other companies, and you have new leadership come in, I think you don't sweep it under the table, you address it head on. And for us, it's really around culture. It's getting in some new leaders to write that. And it's also about the people now who are in charge really having the values that can be embraced by the culture and push that out in the organization. But absolutely, you have to address it head on. And if you look at Uber, like with Arianna Huffington, who's on the board, that's a big part of what she's done there as well.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Are you